It started with silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind that settles on a sleeping world or lingers in the pause between words. The silence was thick, heavy. It stretched across space like a held breath. Too long, too quiet, too wrong. 4 cycles beyond counting, the galaxy spun without them. Empires rose, fell, and rose again. Species fought wars, wrote peace, discovered wonders, and buried horrors. But even through all of that, the one constant was that no one had ever seen them. Until they did. It was a signal. Short. Clip. Coded in an ancient language only the archives remembered. One of the old explorers picked it up on the edge of a dying star system. The message was simple. Only 6 words. We are here. We remember everything. No one took it seriously at first. Old space was full of dead broadcasts and broken dreams. But this one didn't stop. It pulsed over and over, growing stronger, sharper. Like something was waking up. That's when the disappearances began. First, it was a mining colony, small, remote, forgotten. 87 lives. Gone. No distress signal, no explosion, no trace. Then a patrol cruiser. Then a trade convoy. Then 2 worlds stopped transmitting entirely. No one knew what was happening. No one could explain it. The council sent scouts. The scouts never returned. So they sent warships. And that was their mistake. The first fleet went silent 3 days in. No response. No black box. Just nothing. The second fleet never even made it that far. Their systems failed in unison. Engines dead, comms frozen, weapons offline. They drifted for hours, powerless. Then something moved through them. Not a ship. Not a creature. Just pressure. Like the stars themselves leaned in to listen. And when it passed, the crews had changed. Those who came back didn't speak. They didn't blink. They barely breathed. Whatever they saw, it broke them. The council panicked. They called for unity, for strategy, for restraint. But it was too late. Fear had already taken root. Fleets were built in record time. Every species with a weapon pointed it at the dark. And then, they arrived. Not in ships. Not in fire or flame. Not like anything anyone expected. Just people. Human beings. They walked into the center of the galaxy like they'd always belonged. And maybe they had. No one could agree on where they came from. Some said Earth, a lost world wrapped in myths and radiation. Others believed they were born in the stars, seated in silence, waiting to return. But one thing was certain. They were not like the rest of us. They didn't need fleets. They didn't need armies. They brought stories. Old ones. Raw ones. About survival, pain, love, and loss. About building hope out of rubble and memory out of ash. And they told these stories with a voice that cut through every barrier, every defense, every shield. They didn't conquer. They reminded. They didn't destroy. They made others remember. And that was worse. Because memory is sharp. Memory hurts. And in remembering what the galaxy once was, what it lost, and what it did to get here, people began to change. Some wept. Some fought. Some fell to their knees. And still, the humans came, quiet and relentless, peeling back layers of comfort, exposing every wound the galaxy had tried to forget. They didn't speak in threats. They didn't boast. But when they looked at you, it felt like they already knew the worst parts of you, and loved you anyway. That scared people more than war ever could. One world tried to resist. Just one. The humans didn't fight back. They simply walked through fire and fear untouched. By the time the world realized it had lost, its people were no longer the same. They had remembered too much. And then they asked the question. The question that still echoes across every corner of known space. Where were we when the humans were gone? Because deep down everyone knew the truth. This wasn't the first time. The humans had been here before. And they had left for a reason. No one knows why they return now. No one knows what they want. But they are here. And they remember everything. The outpost floated at the edge of known space, tucked against the pole of a red dwarf star that never gave enough warmth. It wasn't much, just a mining relay, a few cargo docks, and a small research hub clinging to the idea of relevance. People were rotated in and out every few months. No one stayed longer than they had to. Terran hated it there. Not because of the cold or the smell of recycled air, or the way the floor always creaked 2 seconds after you stopped walking. No, what Terran hated most was how quiet it got. There was a moment every night, if you could call it night, where the station seemed to stop breathing. Engines low, scanners humming softly, comms traffic thinning out. That's when Terran felt it. Like someone, or something, was watching. Not from a camera or a shadow. From inside. He thought maybe he was losing it. Too many shifts. Too much time staring at the same blinking lights. But lately he wasn't the only one. First it was Maz. She started waking up in cold sweats talking about voices in the static. Then Kun saw movement on the outer deck, something tall, thin and wrong. They laughed it off at first. Isolation messes with your head. Everyone knew that. But the more it happened, the less anyone laughed. And then the signal came again. Same 6 words. We are here. We remember everything. Terran watched it pulse on the main console, clean and clear as if it were only a few kilometers away. But when they tried to trace it, the readings made no sense. It didn't come from a direction. It came from everywhere. That night, no one slept. The station commander ordered a full diagnostic. Nothing turned up. Terran tried to ignore it, but that whisper feeling crept in again. Not a sound exactly, more like the pressure of being near someone who doesn't blink. A presence. Heavy and calm. As if something was waiting for them to speak first. He stared at the console. The message flashed again. We are here. He leaned closer. A second message appeared beneath it. And so are you. He stumbled back. He hadn't typed anything. No one had. They shut down the system. Pulled power. Ran every check again. Still the message stayed. Not in the system, but under it. Hidden in layers they didn't even know existed. Maz quit the next day. Packed her gear and caught the first cargo transport heading out. No one blamed her. But Terran stayed. Because he wanted to understand. The last transmission they got from that outpost was 2 weeks later. Audio only. Static drenched. Almost unintelligible. But one word kept repeating. Human. Over and over. The council classified the incident. Sealed the outpost. Marked the system unstable. But rumors have their own gravity. And this one spread fast. Ships started going dark near the old zones. Merchant vessels reported figures on their decks. Figures that didn't register on sensors but left behind footprints. One freighter swore they heard laughter, human laughter, through hull plating 5 inches thick. At first, the galaxy blamed it on hysteria. Psychological contagion. A shared delusion triggered by the old message. But when a high ambassador's daughter vanished from her shuttle in mid-transit, right through a sealed door with no breach, they stopped calling it delusion. She returned 6 days later. Naked. Silent. Eyes open but seeing something no one else could. She walked up to her father and whispered 3 words into his ear. He hasn't spoken since. That was the moment the council realized this wasn't a threat they could shoot. It was a memory. One old enough to sting. One they had buried long ago. And it was coming back to life. Some species tried to run. Packed up colonies, moved deeper into dark space, thinking they could escape what was coming. They were wrong. The message followed them. Sometimes it carved itself into the walls of their ships. Sometimes it whispered through the airlocks. Always the same words. We are here. And then, the encounters began. At first they were just sightings. A figure in the fog on a jungle moon. A face in the reflections of a frozen lake. Never moving. Just watching. Waiting. Then someone tried to shoot one. That was the first and only time anyone saw them react. The soldier who fired the shot was pulled off his feet, not by force but by grief. He fell to the ground weeping, shaking as if every loss he'd ever felt hit him all at once. He couldn't stop crying. Not for hours. Not even after he passed out from exhaustion. When he woke he couldn't remember who he was. But he remembered the face he saw. Human. They weren't attacking. They were reminding. The galaxy began to fracture. Some called for war. Others for surrender. A few whispered the unthinkable, that maybe the humans weren't the threat at all. Maybe they were the answer. That idea spread slowly like a fire under ice. And it was always met with rage. Because it meant admitting the galaxy had failed. That everything built since the last war, every alliance, every peace treaty, every line drawn in starlight, was a lie. Because the humans had been there first. And they had been forgotten. Or erased. No one would say which. But the silence around their disappearance spoke volumes. Some said the humans left willingly, disgusted by what the galaxy had become. Others claimed they were hunted to extinction by those afraid of what they represented. Both theories had weight. Neither brought comfort. Because now they were back. And they hadn't said why. Not directly. They didn't answer questions. They didn't speak to cameras. They just appeared. One at a time. In the right places. At the right moments. Quiet and patient. And everywhere they went, people changed. Not through force. Through remembering. Old songs. Old fears. Old stories. Things buried so deep even the stars had stopped whispering them. But not the humans. They remembered it all. And they held no anger. That was what made it worse. There was no vengeance in them. Just grief. Like they were mourning something that hadn't died yet, but would. And still no one knew what they wanted. Only that they were here. And they weren't leaving. There was one station that didn't run. Didn't evacuate. Didn't even flinch when the signal started getting stronger. It wasn't a military base or a capital world or anything that ever made headlines. Just a research post floating above a dead planet with rings of ash and bone. They called it Cal 47, but the team who worked there just called it the Circle. The Circle had only one job: to study ancient ruins left behind by a species no one had ever identified. Black stone, smooth as glass, carved with spirals that looped in on themselves endlessly. They'd been there long before the Council. Maybe before light had ever touched the system. No one knew who built them or why. But deep below the surface, buried in vaults locked for millennia, they found something else. A name. Human. Carved into walls of metal older than the stars themselves. Not scratched or painted. Engraved deep and perfect by machines long lost. Machines not even the brightest minds in the galaxy could identify. That was when the fear started to curdle into something else. Curiosity. And then guilt. The Circle didn't run because they believed the humans weren't a threat. They believed the humans were coming home. One of the researchers, Lyra, had a theory. She said the humans didn't vanish. They were taken. Not in ships or by war, but piece by piece. Culture stripped. History erased. Artifacts removed from archives. Names edited out of documents. Species records rewritten. Not wiped out, buried. Not forgotten, forbidden. And if that was true, then the return wasn't a warning. It was a reckoning. Lyra stood at the edge of the crater where the last glyph had been found. The stone glowed faintly under the dust, pulsing in rhythm with her breath. The air around her felt heavy, not with heat but with meaning. She whispered to the wind. "What did we do to you?" There was no answer. Not at first. Then her calm crackled. "We're here," a voice said softly. It wasn't human. But it wasn't alien either. It was both. And neither. She dropped the receiver. Backed away. But the voice stayed. In her head. In her blood. It was remembering her. Elsewhere, on a drifting barge deep in the shivering belt, a child began drawing strange symbols on the walls of her bunk. Her parents thought it was just imagination until the symbols started matching ancient ruins found half a galaxy away. Symbols she'd never seen. When asked how she knew them, she said, "They told me." "Who told you?" "The ones who lost us." At the same time, a convoy of council ships near the Orlean Drift encountered what they thought was a rogue asteroid. It moved too fast, cut too clean. Inside its path, time bent slightly. Instruments failed. Voices from centuries ago whispered through the hull. And at the center of the event, they saw a silhouette. A figure. Floating. Watching. No suit. No fear. Just eyes full of memory. One of the crew broke protocol. Opened a direct comm line. The voice that answered made them all fall silent. "We are the Echo." The ship's records would later note that no words were transmitted. Only felt. And yet, every crew member recited the same phrase afterward. "We were not meant to be forgotten." More and more they appeared, not in groups but as if chosen by pattern or pain. Always where the grief ran deepest. Refugee camps. War zones. Quarantined worlds that had long since gone silent. That's where they walked. Not as ghosts. As mirrors. They showed people what they had hidden from themselves. And in doing so they showed them the truth. One old captain, retired, bitter, full of stories no one believed, saw one near the wreck of his old ship. A young man standing at attention in the vacuum, right where the crew used to gather during drills. The captain didn't look away. He saluted. The figure nodded once and vanished. Later the old man said, "That was my son. He died in the fire. I never told anyone." No one knew what to make of it. The incidents didn't follow rules. They didn't escalate like a traditional invasion. No demands. No fleets. Just presence. And pressure. As if the very existence of humans was bending something out of place. Something the rest of the galaxy had spent too long pretending didn't exist. Then came the event at Trinia Station. A diplomatic summit. High level. Tense. Half the galaxy's leadership in one room. They were discussing how to respond to the anomalies. Whether to prepare for war or negotiate peace. The room went silent mid-sentence. A figure appeared at the far wall. Not walking. Not teleporting. Just existing. One moment not there. The next undeniable. They didn't speak. Didn't move. But everyone in the room began crying. even those who hadn't wept in decades. One ambassador clutched her chest and whispered, "I remember now. I remember what we did." The figure looked at her and smiled, not cruelly, but sadly. Then it turned and faded, not away, but inward, as if it was never here at all. The summit ended without resolution. No plans made, no votes cast, only silence. And in the silence, fear began to shift again, into shame. The galaxy began to whisper about a truth too painful to face out loud. That maybe the humans weren't returning to take back anything. Maybe they had come to see if we were ready to admit what we'd done. To them, to each other, to ourselves. Some called it judgment. Others called it grace. But the word that spread fastest was the simplest one: return. As if their absence had been a wound, and their reappearance, a chance to heal it. But not everyone wanted healing. Some wanted control. And one faction, buried deep in the folds of forgotten space, was already building something. Something old. Something designed long ago during the first silence. A weapon built not to destroy humans, but to erase them again. Completely. As if they never existed. Because some secrets are easier to bury than to confess. And some truths, when spoken out loud, have the power to tear stars apart. And now, it was too late to take any of it back. The humans were here. And they remembered everything. The weapon was already in motion. No one outside the secretive circles of the Nexus Council knew what it was, or even what it could do. It was a plan set in motion long before the humans had started appearing, before the whispers began, before anyone had even realized they were missing. The Council, composed of 100 species, held their power in the quiet spaces. Spaces where no one questioned their motives or their orders. They thought the galaxy would stay quiet forever. But the return of the humans had begun to break that silence. And when the whispers turned into words, they decided it was time to act. The weapon was not a ship nor a fleet. It was a device, buried beneath the surface of a forgotten moon, hidden far beyond the reach of the nearest colonies. Its design had been part of an old project, one that had been abandoned after the first attempts to eradicate the human threat had failed. But the technology never really went away. The Council knew they couldn't completely remove what they had feared, what they still feared. It was the truth they couldn't erase. Now, with the human presence felt again in every corner of space, the device was ready to be activated. They had waited long enough. It was not a weapon that could destroy life. It was worse. It was a weapon that could erase existence itself. Not by violence, but by the slow, methodical process of deletion. Erasing memory, erasing presence, erasing everything that had ever been human from the history of the universe. It was a weapon built to make them forget. A quiet weapon. An unseen weapon. And no one would know what had happened. But the humans knew. And they were waiting. Terran sat in his quarters, his mind unable to quiet. He had known it was coming. Had felt it even before the official reports came in. Something was off. There was a weight in the air, an anxiety that had begun to settle like dust on the edges of his thoughts. The station was quiet again tonight, just as it had been the last few nights. Nothing but the sound of the hum from the engines, the soft pulse of the power grid, the low buzz of monitors. The air felt thick, and Terran couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He looked down at the message from earlier. It had been like all the others. A single line of text that didn't belong. No matter how many times they tried to track it, the source was always the same. We are here. But this time something was different. The message was no longer just a whisper. It had become a presence. In the stillness he could feel it in his chest like a thrum against his ribs. His hands clenched, his breathing shallow. Terran stood abruptly, turning away from the console. His thoughts felt like they were slipping away from him, like they were being carried on a current he couldn't stop. He needed to focus. Needed to figure out what was happening. There was a knock at the door. Terran froze. "Come in," he said, his voice hoarse. The door slid open and Mass stepped inside. She looked worse than before, her skin pale, eyes sunken. She hadn't spoken to him since her sudden departure weeks ago. Now she was back, though there was a wariness in her gaze, like she wasn't sure whether to trust him. "I know what you're thinking," she said quietly, her voice heavy. "But we can't ignore it anymore. It's not just the message." Terran nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I don't know what to think. This isn't just a transmission. It's something else." Mass took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "We're not the only ones hearing it, Terran. There's something happening in the systems. Something we can't explain." "Explain?" Terran echoed, his mind racing. "How do you mean?" She glanced over her shoulder as if checking for anyone else. "It's like they're here. Not just the message. It's them. We've been getting reports from other stations. From ships that have crossed paths with them, humans or whatever they are now. The ones who remember everything. Terran felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. The humans? Maz nodded. They're changing people, Terran. Not with violence, but something deeper. People are remembering things they didn't know they knew. It's like they've awakened something inside of us. Something buried. Terran turned back to the console, his eyes lingering on the glowing message. The message that had now appeared 3 times in the last hour. We are here. And with those words came a terrifying truth. They weren't just here. They were inside. Infiltrating everything. He couldn't tell Maz that he had felt the same. That every night he had been hearing whispers in his sleep. He couldn't explain it, he didn't understand it himself. But something was happening to him too. Something subtle. Something he didn't want to acknowledge. There's a reason why they're here, Maz, he said, his voice low. And it's not because they want to destroy us. Maz blinked as if startled by his certainty. What do you mean? Terran swallowed, his throat dry. They're here because they want to be remembered. He stared at the message, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the words, of the connection. We are here. Not to fight. Not to conquer. But to remind. And somewhere deep inside, he realized it wasn't just the humans who needed remembering. It was everyone. Everything. Meanwhile, far from Terran's outpost, the Nexus Council had already begun preparations. They had activated the weapon, sent it into motion with the cold precision they had always trusted. They had buried their shame in secrecy for so long, they thought they could silence everything forever. But deep in the shadows of their control rooms, one figure remained uncertain. He had seen the evidence, heard the rumors, felt the pressure building from every corner of the galaxy. And yet, he still couldn't bring himself to believe it. The humans weren't just returning. They were coming back to reclaim what had been taken from them. And they weren't going to leave without making everyone remember. The message never stopped coming. Terran sat in the dim light of his quarters, eyes glued to the glowing screen in front of him. The words flickered again, we are here. They had stopped coming at regular intervals now. It wasn't just a broadcast from one source anymore. It felt more like a ripple, a vibration that resonated with the very air around him. It was as though the words were everywhere, pressing against his mind. He couldn't stop hearing them. Even when he wasn't near the console, they echoed in his head. Every quiet moment, every empty stretch of time, they filled the silence. We are here. We are here. We are here. It had become a mantra, a pulse that seemed to grow louder the longer he resisted it. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but he couldn't bring himself to type anything. What was the point? What was he supposed to say to something that had no origin, no reason for being? The voice in his mind wasn't the same as a transmission. It wasn't mechanical or cold. It didn't have the detached, calculated tone of any alien race he'd encountered in his years of service. No, this voice was familiar. It carried a weight of sadness, of loss, of longing. It was as if it had been waiting for this moment for as long as he had been alive. Waiting for him. Waiting for all of them. Why now? Terran whispered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. What do you want? His answer came from the far corner of his quarters, a strange vibration rising from the floor. At first he thought it was just the ship systems, but the hum was different this time. It was too distinct, too intentional. It felt alive. He stood, heart pounding in his chest, and approached the wall, placing a hand against it. The vibration intensified, humming beneath his palm, thrumming like the heartbeat of something ancient. He drew his hand back, startled. His mind raced to connect the dots, but nothing made sense. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive, but it was the kind of silence that didn't feel like peace. It felt like a pause before a storm. Before he could process what was happening, his comm panel flashed to life with an incoming message. He froze. It wasn't supposed to be time for any updates. The message appeared as a string of encrypted data, nothing out of the ordinary. But as Terran began to decode it, he felt a strange knot of unease twist in his stomach. The text was simple, but its meaning hit him like a blow to the chest. Look to the sky. It wasn't signed. It wasn't from anyone he recognized. But the feeling he got as he read it sent an icy shiver down his spine. Elsewhere on the station, Maz was trying to hold it together. The fear that had been steadily creeping into her thoughts had blossomed into something much larger now. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. It wasn't just paranoia. It was a certainty deep in her bones. She had spent the last several hours combing through station logs, looking for any clue that might explain the strange events they'd been witnessing. But nothing had been particularly useful. All the reports led to dead ends or vague references to anomalies, too many anomalies. What had started as a quiet tremor under their feet had grown into a growing wave of distortion. She could feel the weight of it on her chest as she walked through the dimly lit corridors of the station. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the usual hum of the engines felt like an echo from somewhere far away. Was this paranoia too? Or was it the calm before the storm? Maz paused at the window overlooking the dark expanse of space. The stars were distant and cold as they always were. But tonight the darkness felt different. It felt alive somehow. She shivered as her gaze shifted to the planet below, its surface swathed in shadows. There was something unsettling about it now. Something almost waiting. She pressed her hand against the glass as if reaching out to touch the emptiness. "They're coming," she whispered, her breath fogging the window. She couldn't explain it, but she knew it deep inside. She could feel them too. Not physically, but in the way the air seemed to vibrate with something unsaid. Like the universe itself was holding its breath. Terran returned to the main control center hours later, his mind a blur of questions and half-formed thoughts. He barely registered the faces of the few crew members still awake, their eyes glazed over from exhaustion or fear. No one spoke, but the tension in the air was palpable. They were all feeling it, whether they admitted it to each other or not. It was as if an invisible weight was pressing down on them, slowly suffocating them. He approached the console, his fingers trembling as he tried to focus on the task at hand. His mind wandered again, too restless to stay still. What did it all mean? The message. The vibration. The sudden presence of them. And then his comm panel buzzed. It wasn't a message this time, but a direct link to Maz. "Is it happening again?" he asked, his voice a mix of exhaustion and urgency. "It's more than that," she replied. "I think we're too late." Terran's stomach dropped at the words. He'd been dreading that. But he didn't let it show. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. But the signs are everywhere. Them. They've been here for a long time, Terran. Maybe longer than we realize. Maybe longer than we're willing to admit." Terran stared at the panel in front of him. The words didn't make sense. He wanted to argue, to push back against the panic in her voice. But a part of him, the part that had been listening to the message in his head, knew she was right. The humans were back. And they hadn't come to destroy. They had come to remind. Somewhere, hidden in the forgotten corners of the galaxy, the Nexus Council had begun the final steps of their plan. They knew they had little time left. The message was spreading. The humans were awakening, and the galaxy was starting to remember things they had long since erased. The weapon, once dormant, had been activated. A flash of light streaked across the darkened space. It was bright, too bright, like a beacon calling them home. And then the darkness swallowed it whole. The weapon was unlike anything they had ever created. It wasn't a bomb or a laser. It wasn't something that could be aimed or fired. It was a distortion. A fracture in the very fabric of time and space, designed to pull at the threads of existence itself. It was built to erase the humans from the record of the galaxy. To make them disappear as if they had never existed at all. But in the quiet of the forgotten moon, there was no one there to witness the first strike. No one except the humans who had been waiting. Back on the station, Terran stared out the viewport. The stars, the space, the quiet, all of it felt different now. The universe had changed, and he could no longer ignore the truth that was pressing in on him. The humans had come home. But what if it wasn't a return at all? What if they had always been here? And they were waiting for something far darker to come to light. He turned to Maz, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. "They're not here to save us, Maz. They're here to remind us. To make us see what we've forgotten." She met his gaze, her eyes wide with realization. "We're not just the ones who've been forgotten," she whispered. "We're the ones who forgot." And somewhere, in the far reaches of space, the darkness waited. Terran couldn't escape the feeling that something was unraveling. It wasn't just the station or the ships they had detected off in the distance. No, this was deeper. The very fabric of reality felt as though it was being tugged in 1,000 directions, each thread coming undone inch by inch. The message, the vibration, the eerie sense of being watched, they were all part of something far greater than he had been prepared for. He tried to reach Maz again, but the comms were down. The usual hum of the station's communication system had gone eerily silent. Panic gnawed at him, but he forced himself to focus. Whatever was happening, he couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. The station lights flickered, casting long shadows along the walls. The eerie stillness grew heavier with each passing moment. It wasn't the kind of silence that could be ignored. It was alive, suffocating, as if every corner of the station had become aware of its own vulnerability. As if it was waiting. Terran moved quickly through the hallways, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. He passed the same familiar corridors, but now they felt alien, unsettling. Even the air had changed, thick with an unease that made every breath feel labored. He reached the central command room where a few crew members were still huddled around monitors, staring at the screens with pale faces. They didn't need to speak. The tension in their eyes said it all. "I tried to reach Maz," one of them whispered. "The signals are all jammed. It's like something's blocking us. Blocking everything." Terran's heart skipped. If the communication lines were being deliberately severed, it meant they were being isolated. And that meant whatever was coming, it wasn't just a message anymore. It was a threat. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "Have you tried broadcasting a signal to the fleet? To anyone?" No response. Another crew member answered, voice shaky. "It's like everything's gone silent." Terran's pulse quickened. It wasn't just a blockage. It was as if the universe itself was pushing back, shutting them off from the rest of existence. "They're here," Terran muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible even to himself. He didn't need to look out the viewport to know. The air itself felt thick with their presence. Their proximity. The humanity that had once been forgotten was suddenly close. Too close. But just as quickly, a crackling sound broke the silence, sharp and jarring. It came from the comms panel, and for a moment, Terran thought it might just be static, an anomaly in the system. But then something shifted. The message came again. "We are here. We are waiting." The words were the same, but this time they had weight. The kind of weight that pressed against his chest, forcing him to breathe slower, more deliberately. The feeling was stronger now, a pulse in his bones, in his veins. It was as if the message wasn't just coming from the comms, it was coming from everywhere. The walls. The air. His own mind. Terran staggered back, gripping the nearest console for support, his breath shallow. "What the hell is going on?" he hissed. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the pieces, but it was as if the puzzle was shifting before his eyes. Nothing fit. Nothing aligned. There was a sudden screeching noise, a distortion in the air, a crackling like metal being torn apart. The station's gravity fluctuated, and everything around him seemed to warp, as if space itself was buckling under the strain. The crew members in the room exchanged frantic glances, but none of them moved. None of them dared to. Terran grabbed the nearest control panel and slammed his fist into it. "We need to prepare for whatever this is. We need." The lights flickered again, this time more violently. And then, all at once, the station's main viewport lit up with a blinding flash. Terran squinted, his heart hammering as the light grew more intense. Something had appeared in space. A ship? A vessel? It was too large, too vast to be anything they'd ever encountered. It stretched across the viewport, impossibly massive, with tendrils of dark energy curling around it like storm clouds. A chill ran down Terran's spine, his mouth going dry. This was no ordinary ship. This was something that had no place in the galaxy, something that shouldn't even be possible. "It's them," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're here." The crew scrambled, desperate to understand what they were seeing. But Terran was frozen, his eyes locked on the ship. It was wrong. It shouldn't exist. The shape of it, like a twisted, broken reflection of reality itself, defied all logic. It was as though it were not merely a ship, but a tear in the fabric of existence. The ship pulsed, emitting waves of energy that rippled outward, distorting the space around it. The distortion spread through the station like a shock wave, warping reality in its wake. Terran felt a sharp pain in his head, his vision blurring as the edges of everything seemed to bend and stretch. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the distortion stopped. The ship was gone. The viewport was empty. And for a heartbeat, Terran thought it might have been a hallucination. But the lingering feeling in the pit of his stomach told him otherwise. "We're not alone," someone whispered in the quiet, their voice trembling. Terran swallowed hard, fighting the nausea threatening to rise in his throat. He turned to face the crew, his mind still reeling from the sight, the reality-bending power of what they had just witnessed. "It's starting," he said, his voice hoarse. "And it's not going to stop." But just as he was about to speak again, the station's alarms went off, loud and jarring, cutting through the tension like a knife. Red lights flashed across the walls, bathing the room in an eerie, chaotic glow. The distress signal began to beep, followed by the same distorted voice that had haunted them all along. "We are here." And then a crackling sound. The voice now clearer than ever before. Prepare to remember. We are not alone. The words echoed in the room, carrying a sense of finality that made the blood run cold in Terran's veins. He looked at the crew, seeing the fear reflected in their eyes. They all knew it now. The truth they had tried to deny was happening. Whatever had been set in motion had already begun. The humans, the forgotten ones, had come back. And they were not here for peace. The station shuddered once again, but this time, it wasn't the usual tremor. This felt different, as if something massive, something ancient, was stirring in the dark spaces of the universe, waking up. Terran felt his knees weaken, but he forced himself to stay standing. We need to act now. We don't know what they're capable of, but we can't sit here waiting for it to consume us. The crew, too afraid to speak, nodded in agreement. But in that moment, Terran knew they were all thinking the same thing. They had no idea what was coming next. And neither did he. The station's shuddering subsided, but the air felt heavier than before. Terran could feel the weight of every heartbeat, the pulse of something dark and relentless pressing against them. He tried to focus, tried to shake off the bone-deep dread that gnawed at his mind, but every passing second seemed to stretch further into the unknown. The crew remained silent, eyes wide, faces pale, each of them aware of the gravity of what they had just witnessed. They were no longer merely part of a mission. They were witnesses to something that didn't belong in their universe. Something ancient. Something alive. Terran turned toward the command console, desperate to find something that could make sense of what they were dealing with. But every piece of data seemed irrelevant, fractured. The reports of the mysterious signals, the distortions in space, the anomalies, everything was converging into a single question. What were these entities? What did they want? And why had the humans been forgotten? Why now? Why had they returned? The voice crackled through the comms again, distant but clear. We are waiting. It repeated over and over, each echo seeping into Terran's skin like cold water, seeping into his very soul. It was getting louder. The message had changed too. The time is upon you. Prepare. It was then that something else happened, a sound sharp and unnatural. A pulse resonating through the walls, reverberating deep within the station's metal skeleton. Terran's head snapped up, his thoughts scattered, his pulse quickening as the lights flickered once more. This time they didn't just flicker, they stuttered as though struggling to remain on. Report, he barked, voice breaking through the tension that had thickened around them. One of the crew members tapped furiously at the control panel, eyes wide with shock. There's something else. Something new. They paused, blinking in disbelief. The distortion. It's everywhere. It's not just a localized field anymore. It's expanding. Spreading. Terran's stomach lurched. Spreading? What do you mean, spreading? The station, it's morphing. Terran's heart skipped a beat. What? The words didn't fully register at first. Morphing? The station wasn't a living entity, it was a metal structure, built to withstand the harshest conditions. But the look in the crew members' eyes, wide, horrified, told him everything he needed to know. They were all seeing the same thing now. Something impossible. Something beyond their understanding. The walls of the station, the very framework of their world, began to shift. Not in a mechanical way, not in a way that could be explained by malfunctioning systems or programming errors. No, this was different. The walls seemed to breathe. They pulsed as if alive, bending and twisting, contorting as though the station itself were struggling to maintain its shape. Terran stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He had to grab onto the nearest rail to keep himself from falling. The crew members were scrambling, trying to make sense of it, shouting orders, but there was no order to the chaos. The station was falling apart in real time, its structure being torn apart and remade by something they couldn't control. And then a voice, that voice, boomed through the comms so loud it rattled his teeth. You will remember what you were. You will remember your purpose. The word sent a cold wave through him. Remember your purpose. The message was clear now. This wasn't just about humans coming back. It was about reclaiming something lost. Something essential. But what? What was it? The distorted, impossible voice broke through again, louder this time. The time for hiding is over. You will know. Terran's mind raced. The station, the very place that had been their sanctuary, was turning against them, reshaping itself to something unrecognizable. There were no answers, no solutions. Only a creeping, terrifying sense of inevitability. He turned toward the viewport, trying to focus on something outside the station to ground himself. But what he saw made him freeze. For a moment he thought his eyes were deceiving him. No. It wasn't the station breaking apart. It was the entire view of space itself, distorting, warping, bending. Reality was shifting in front of him, twisting in ways he couldn't comprehend. A massive, dark shape was forming in the distance, creeping along the horizon of the stars. It wasn't a ship, not in any conventional sense. It was more like a rift, a tear in the fabric of space, something ancient and primal. And within it, faint shapes flickered, something more, something beyond human comprehension, waiting. Terran's breath caught in his throat. "We're not just dealing with a ship," he whispered, his voice shaking with a raw, visceral fear. "We're dealing with something that can reshape everything." The crew was silent, too stunned to speak. But the realization hit them all at once. It wasn't just their lives at risk anymore. It was the very fabric of existence. Whatever these beings, whatever they were, had come for, it was bigger than any of them. Bigger than the station. Bigger than the fleet. Bigger than humanity. The station trembled again, this time harder, as if whatever force was coming had reached the outer edge of the station. Terran felt a pressure building, a suffocating weight that crushed against his chest. The walls were groaning, the very foundation of the station straining against some invisible force that pushed and pulled at it. "We have to leave," someone whispered, but it was clear that there was nowhere left to go. The rift, that impossibly massive distortion, had closed in too fast. Too suddenly. And then, as if responding to the fear that had taken root in every crew member's heart, the lights on the station went out. Complete darkness engulfed them. A silence so complete, it felt like a physical thing pressing against them, suffocating them. "The time has come." The voice echoed in their minds, no longer transmitted through the comms. It was in their heads now. "Remember." Terran's eyes snapped open, but all he could see was black. The station was gone. There was no way back. They had crossed a line, and now there was no escaping what had been unleashed. And in that darkness, in that suffocating silence, he heard the sound he had been dreading. The sound of something enormous, something incomprehensible moving toward them. The final twist. The end of their world had begun. The darkness didn't just feel like an absence of light anymore. It felt like a presence, like it had weight, like it was watching. Terran held his breath, feeling the stale air tighten around him. The last thing he remembered clearly was the voice, echoing inside his skull, telling him to remember. But what? What was it they were meant to remember? Then it hit him. It wasn't a command. It was a warning. The hum of the station's internal systems came back to life in stutters. Not all at once, but like a heartbeat returning after a long silence. One screen flickered on. Then another. And another. The station wasn't gone. Not entirely. It had changed. Shifted. But it wasn't lost. The shape beyond the glass, that giant tear in space, was still there, growing. But now it pulsed with a color Terran had no name for. It was like staring at memory and fire and pain all at once. One of the crew whispered, "Look." On the main screen a figure appeared. Human. Or something that had once been. Its face was cracked like old stone, its eyes glowing with a soft, aching blue. It didn't speak, but the crew heard it anyway. "We tried to protect you from this." The voice was layered, 100 tones speaking as one. Male, female, young, old. All of it at once. Terran staggered forward, unable to tear his gaze away. "Who are you?" The figure blinked slowly. "We are you. We are what you would have become had you stayed. Had you remembered. Asterisk. A wall opened silently behind them, revealing a chamber that hadn't existed moments before. Inside, another rift, smaller, more focused. Around it were fragments, pieces of human history, technology, emotion, pain. It wasn't a museum. It was a map. Everything clicked. They weren't supposed to come back. This was never just about humans returning to deep space. This was about finishing something. Healing something. The ones who stayed behind, who had gone too far into the unknown, had changed. Evolved. And now they needed something only the original humans still had. Emotion. Empathy. Memory. Pain. The figure on the screen spoke again. Asterisk, you remember loss. That is your strength. We forgot. And it broke us. Asterisk. A console lit up beside Terran. Coordinates. A choice. Leave now. Seal the rift. Preserve what was left of Earth, of humanity. Or step through. Join them. Sacrifice their individuality to become part of something vast, something unknowable. The crew argued, desperate, afraid. But Terran knew the answer. He stepped toward the console and chose the third option. He opened the rift wider. The station screamed with light and force as the two timelines collided, the past and future of humanity clashing like storms. But Terran held firm. Not to destroy. Not to merge. But to remember. A blinding flash consumed them. And then silence. When the light faded, the station was back in its orbit. The tear was gone. The screen showed Earth. Whoa. Whoa. And yet, something had changed. The crew stood slowly. Nobody spoke. Because they all remembered now. Not facts. Not images. They remembered being something else. Someone else. Somewhere else. Terran felt at last. A moment of peace. Then a whisper in the back of his mind. Asterisk, well done. But you were never meant to return alone. Asterisk. The final twist came not in terror but in understanding. Because standing behind him where no one had stood before, was the figure again. And this time it looked just like him. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun. The air on the station was still, but something inside each of them had shifted. The figure that looked like Terran wasn't a threat. It wasn't a copy, or some synthetic imitation. It was the part of him that had gone into the rift and come back changed. It smiled. A quiet, small smile, like someone who'd been gone too long and had finally come home. Terran stared, searching for fear in himself and finding none. There was only understanding now. A quiet kind of grief and peace rolled into one. The others didn't say a word. They didn't have to. Each of them felt the same pull inside, a thread tying them not just to the station or Earth, but to the version of themselves that had reached beyond fear. The rift was gone, but what it left behind wasn't emptiness. It was memory. Real memory. Not of events or dates or coordinates. Of feelings. Regret, love, anger, sacrifice. They carried it now like fire in their bones. The Earth that glowed on their monitors wasn't the one they'd left. It was healed. Not perfect, no world ever was, but whole in a way they hadn't seen in generations. Forests regrown, oceans clearer, skies quieter. There were still people there. Living, laughing, struggling. But something deeper had taken root. News from Earth started to come in slowly. At first just static. Then voices. Then images. People were remembering things they never lived through. A woman in Kenya waking from a dream where she stood on Mars. A child in Brazil drawing symbols from a lost language no one had taught her. A teacher in Australia weeping in the middle of class because she could feel a presence in her heart whispering that humanity had made it. They were sharing the burden now. The knowledge. The pain. The truth of what humanity had been through in the stars, what it had nearly become, and what it chose instead. It wasn't about being the strongest, the smartest, the fastest. It was about knowing when to feel. When to stop running. When to stand in front of something terrifying and say, I remember who I am. The station began to drift back toward the Earth's pull. Gently. Like a feather on a breeze. The systems, once foreign and broken, now responded like extensions of the crew. The ship had changed because they had. The figure that was Terran, but also not, walked beside him now silently. No one questioned it. No one feared it. It was part of the cost. Part of the truth. As they entered Earth's orbit, the world below began lighting up. Not with cities or weapons. With signals. Lights. Beacons. As if the whole planet was waiting for them. And it was. They didn't descend to a fanfare or a parade. They came down quiet. Like rain. Scattered in different parts of the world, the crew stepped off the dropships and simply walked into life. Into old places that felt new. Into families that didn't know them, but somehow welcomed them with open arms. Because now, the memory of the journey didn't belong to just the few who lived it. It belonged to everyone. Terran ended up in a small village by the sea. No one asked where he had been. They knew. Somehow they knew. The stars still called to him at night, but they didn't ache the way they used to. He could look up and feel the story, not the loss. One evening, as the wind rolled in and the sky turned the color of old paper, a girl ran up to him, her eyes wide with the kind of wonder he'd forgotten existed. Are you the one who opened the sky? She asked. He looked at her, heart soft and full. No, he said gently. We all did. And she smiled as if she understood. Somewhere far off, another rift opened. Smaller. Brighter. But no one was afraid. Because now they remembered. They knew what it meant. It was a door, not a trap. A path forward, not a punishment. And so, when the next crew stepped through, new hearts, new minds, they weren't leaving something behind. They were bringing humanity with them. The last message ever sent from the station read simply. And then came the humans. The darkness didn't just feel like an absence of light anymore. It felt like a presence. Like it had weight. Like it was watching. Terran held his breath, feeling the stale air tighten around him. The last thing he remembered clearly was the voice, echoing inside his skull, telling him to remember. But what? What was it they were meant to remember? Then it hit him. It wasn't a command. It was a warning. The hum of the station's internal systems came back to life in stutters. Not all at once, but like a heartbeat returning after a long silence. One screen flickered on. Then another. And another. The station wasn't gone. Not entirely. It had changed. Shifted. But it wasn't lost. The shape beyond the glass, that giant tear in space, was still there, growing. But now it pulsed with a color Terran had no name for. It was like staring at memory and fire and pain all at once. One of the crew whispered, "Look." On the main screen a figure appeared. Human. Or something that had once been. Its face was cracked like old stone, its eyes glowing with a soft, aching blue. It didn't speak, but the crew heard it anyway. "We tried to protect you from this." The voice was layered, 100 tones speaking as one. Male, female, young, old. All of it at once. Terran staggered forward, unable to tear his gaze away. "Who are you?" The figure blinked slowly. "We are you. We are what you would have become had you stayed. Had you remembered. A wall opened silently behind them, revealing a chamber that hadn't existed moments before. Inside, another rift, smaller, more focused. Around it were fragments, pieces of human history, technology, emotion, pain. It wasn't a museum. It was a map. Everything clicked. They weren't supposed to come back. This was never just about humans returning to deep space. This was about finishing something. Healing something. The ones who stayed behind, who had gone too far into the unknown, had changed. Evolved. And now they needed something only the original humans still had. Emotion. Empathy. Memory. Pain. The figure on the screen spoke again. You remember loss. That is your strength. We forgot. And it broke us. A console lit up beside Terran. Coordinates. A choice. Leave now. Seal the rift. Preserve what was left of Earth, of humanity. Or step through. Join them. Sacrifice their individuality to become part of something vast, something unknowable. The crew argued, desperate, afraid. But Terran knew the answer. He stepped toward the console and chose the third option. He opened the rift wider. The station screamed with light and force as the two timelines collided, the past and future of humanity clashing like storms. But Terran held firm. Not to destroy. Not to merge. But to remember. A blinding flash consumed them. And then silence. When the light faded, the station was back in its orbit. The tear was gone. The screen showed Earth. Blow. Oh. And yet, something had changed. The crew stood slowly. Nobody spoke. Because they all remembered now. Not facts. Not images. They remembered being something else. Someone else. Somewhere else. Terran felt at last. A moment of peace. Then a whisper in the back of his mind. Well done. But you were never meant to return alone. The final twist came not in terror but in understanding. Because standing behind him, where no one had stood before, was the figure again. And this time it looked just like him. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun. Terran turned to face the other version of himself. He didn't speak and neither did the double. But there was something exchanged between them, like memories passing in silence, filling in gaps neither had noticed before. The others watched, uncertain, waiting. The second Terran nodded once and walked past him, heading toward the main chamber. As he moved, the ship shifted again, walls bending with soft groans, systems activating with a hum that sounded more like breath than machine. And then the stars changed. Outside the viewports, the constellations reoriented, spinning like a compass realigning to a new true north. They weren't just in Earth's orbit anymore. They weren't even in their own time. Terran's voice finally broke the silence. "We're not done." He turned back to the crew. "Whatever they became, it wasn't whole. Not without us. But now we remember what they lost. And we still feel what they can't." The crew, still reeling from all they'd seen, nodded slowly. Some cried. Some held on to each other. But none backed away. Because now they understood. It wasn't about saving the future. It was about healing the past. And with each step they took into that new light, they carried with them the most human thing of all. The ability to hope. That was what the others had forgotten. And that was what would change everything. Forever.